Rule 4. Always say less than necessary. When you're trying to impress people with words, the more you say, the more common you appear, and the less in control. Even when you're saying something banal, it will seem original if you make it vague, open-ended, and mysterious. Powerful people impress and intimidate by saying less. The more you say, the more likely you are to say something foolish. A transgression of the law. Gnaeus Marcius, also known as Coriolanus, was a great military hero of ancient Rome. In the first half of the 5th century BC, he won many important battles, saving the city from calamity time and time again. Because he spent most of his life on the battlefield, few Romans knew him personally, which made him something of a legendary figure. In 454 BC, Coriolanus decided it was time to exploit his reputation and enter politics. He stood for election to the high rank of consul. Candidates for this position traditionally made a public address early in the race. When Coriolanus came before the people, he began by displaying the dozens of scars he had accumulated over 17 years of fighting for Rome. Few in the crowd really heard the lengthy speech that followed. Those scars, proof of his valor and patriotism, moved the people to tears. His election seemed certain. When polling day arrived, however, Coriolanus made his entrance into the forum, escorted by the entire Senate and the city's patricians, the aristocracy. The common people who saw this were unsettled by such a blustering show of confidence on election day. Then Coriolanus spoke again, directing his words mostly at the wealthy citizens who had accompanied him. His tone was arrogant and insolent. Claiming certain victory in the vote, he boasted of his battlefield exploits, made sour jokes that appealed only to the patricians, voiced angry accusations against his opponents, and speculated on the riches he would bring to Rome. This time, the people listened carefully. They had not realized that this legendary soldier was also a common braggart. News of the speech spread quickly through Rome, and the people turned out in great numbers to make sure he was not elected. Defeated, Coriolanus returned to the battlefield, bitter and vowing revenge on the common folk who had voted against him. Some weeks later, a large shipment of grain arrived in Rome. The Senate was ready to distribute this food to the people for free. But just as they were preparing to vote on the question, Coriolanus appeared and took the Senate floor. The distribution, he argued, would have a harmful effect on the city as a whole. Several senators appeared won over, and the vote fell into doubt. But Coriolanus didn't stop there. He went on to condemn the very concept of democracy. He advocated abolishing the people's representatives, the tribunes, and handing the governing of the city entirely to the patricians. When word of this speech reached the people, their anger knew no bounds. The tribunes were sent to the Senate to demand that Coriolanus appear before them. He refused. Riots broke out across the city. The Senate, fearing the people's wrath, finally voted in favor of the grain distribution. The tribunes were appeased, but the people still demanded that Coriolanus speak to them and apologize. If he repented and agreed to keep his opinions to himself, he would be allowed to return to the battlefield. Coriolanus did appear one last time before the people, who listened to him in rapt silence. He started slowly and softly, but as the speech went on, he grew more and more blunt. Yet again he hurled insults. His tone was arrogant. His expression was disdainful. The more he spoke, the angrier the crowd became. Finally, they shouted him down and silenced him. The tribunes conferred, condemned Coriolanus to death, and ordered the magistrates to take him at once to the top of the Tarpeian rock and throw him over. The delighted crowd seconded the decision. The patricians, however, managed to intervene, and the sentence was reduced to lifelong banishment. When the people learned that Rome's great military hero would never return to the city, they celebrated in the streets. In fact, no one had ever witnessed such a celebration, not even after the defeat of a foreign enemy. Interpretation. Before his entrance into politics, the name of Coriolanus evoked awe. His battlefield accomplishments marked him as a man of great bravery. Since the citizens knew so little about him personally, all kinds of legends had attached themselves to his name. But the moment he appeared before the Roman people and spoke his mind, all that grandeur and mystery vanished. He bragged and blustered like a common soldier. He insulted and slandered people as if he felt threatened and insecure. Suddenly, he was not at all what the people had imagined. The gap between the legend and the reality proved deeply disappointing to those who had wanted to believe in their hero. The more Coriolanus said, the less powerful he appeared. A person who cannot control his words shows that he cannot control himself and is unworthy of respect. Had he said less, the people would never have had cause to be offended. They would never have known his true feelings. He would have kept his powerful aura, almost certainly won the consulship, and been able to advance his goals quietly. But the human tongue is a beast that few can master. It strains constantly to break free of its cage, and if it isn't tamed, it will run wild and cause you grief. Power cannot accrue to those who squander their treasure of words. As Leonardo da Vinci once observed, oysters open completely when the moon is full. When a crab sees one, it throws a piece of stone or seaweed inside, and the oyster cannot close again. It becomes the crab's meal. Such is the fate of anyone who opens their mouth too much and puts themselves at the mercy of the listener. An observance of the law. In the court of Louis XIV, nobles and ministers would spend days and nights debating issues of state. They would confer, argue, form and break alliances, and argue again, until finally the critical moment arrived. Two of them would be chosen to present the opposing sides directly to Louis, who would make the final decision. After these representatives were chosen, everyone would argue some more. How should the issues be framed? What would appeal to Louis, and what would annoy him? At what time of day should they approach him, and in which part of the Palace of Versailles? What expression should they wear on their faces? Finally, after all of this was settled, the fateful moment would arrive. The two men would approach Louis, always a delicate matter, and when they at last had his attention, they would lay out the issue in careful detail, spelling out every option. Louis would listen in complete silence, an utterly enigmatic expression on his face. When each man had finished his presentation and asked for the king's opinion, Louis would look at them both and say simply, "I shall see."
Je verrai.
Then he would walk away. The ministers and courtiers would never hear another word on the matter from the king. They would simply see the result weeks later when he came to a decision and acted. he would never bother to consult them again. Interpretation. Louis XIV was a man of very few words. His most famous remark, "L'État, c'est moi," meaning, "I am the state," was as concise as it was commanding. His notorious "I shall see" was just one of several extremely short phrases he applied to all manner of requests. Louis wasn't always this way. As a young man, he was known for talking at length, delighting in his own eloquence. His later silence was self-imposed, a deliberate act, a mask he wore to keep everyone around him off balance. No one knew exactly where he stood. No one could predict his reactions, and no one could try to deceive him by saying what they thought he wanted to hear, because no one knew what he wanted to hear. As they talked on and on before the silent king, they revealed more and more about themselves, information he would later use against them to great effect. In the end, Louis's silence kept those around him terrified and under his thumb. It was one of the very foundations of his power. As the writer Saint-Simon observed, no one knew as well as Louis how to make his words, his smiles, and even his glances feel precious. Everything about him carried weight because he created distinctions, and his authority was only enhanced by how rarely he chose to speak. As Cardinal de Retz put it, "It is even more damaging for a minister to say foolish things than to do them."